Please, someone, anyone, help me." The orphan's voice cracked through the bitter wind, lost among the endless plains. She had no family, no home, and now the cruel rancher's men dragged her toward a fate she didn't deserve. Every eye in the dusty town seemed blind to her despair, their whispers sharp as the barbed fences that enclosed her world. She trembled, her dress torn, her spirit bruised, but still she dared to hope. And then, a shadow appeared at the edge of the corral, a lone cowboy, tall, silent, his eyes burning with a promise that no injustice could break. He stepped forward, voice low but resolute. "I swear, I'll stop this, or die trying." The town held its breath, the winds shifted. A story of forbidden courage, betrayal, and love was about to erupt, and no one would ever forget the day one vow froze an entire town. "Please, someone, anyone." Eliza's voice cracked, carried on the morning wind like a fragile plea swallowed by the vast emptiness of the prairie. The sun rose over the dusty town of Dry Creek, illuminating the dirt streets in a harsh golden glare that reflected the unforgiving cruelty of the world around her. At 16, barely a girl, she was a fragile figure in a worn dress, ribbons tangled and frayed in her dark hair, knees pressed into the dry earth as she struggled to steady her trembling hands. Her chest heaved, and every word she whispered seemed to vanish into the mocking laughter of the townsfolk. "I have no family, no one to protect me," she murmured, tears carving bright trails down her dusty cheeks. The crowd around her was not silent with pity. They were silent with fear, curiosity, and the faint thrill of cruelty. Whispers rippled through the bystanders, some afraid to intervene, others finding cruel amusement in her despair. And at the center of it all stood Silas Crow, the man who had claimed her life before she even understood what it meant to truly live. His eyes were cold, hard, like chipped obsidian, his mouth curling into a sneer as he gripped her arm and pulled her toward his waiting carriage. Every step of the wheels on the dry street was a hammer striking the rhythm of her impending doom. From the shadows at the edge of the street, Jackson leaned against a weathered post, his hat tipped low over eyes that burned with quiet fury. He had ridden through many towns, seen suffering and injustice, but something about Eliza's frail form, about the hopeless tremor in her voice, struck deep into a corner of his heart he rarely let anyone touch. His jaw tightened, a subtle clench that mirrored the tension rising in the town around him. The air was thick with the smell of dust, sweat, and the faint tang of danger. Jackson's hand hovered near the grip of his revolver, not yet drawn, but ready. Every muscle in his body coiled like a spring. He watched as Silas's cruel smile widened, the ropes of authority and power around him making him feel untouchable. And yet Jackson felt the undeniable pull of justice, a magnetic force that demanded action. "I won't let him do this. Not today," he murmured under his breath, the words almost lost beneath the clatter of the carriage wheels. He stepped forward, letting the sunlight fall fully across his face, and for the first time, the crowd noticed him. The sudden presence of someone unafraid, someone who refused to look away, caused a ripple of unease to pass through the townsfolk. Eliza, barely able to lift her head, caught a glimpse of him from the corner of her tear-streaked eyes. There was a spark in his gaze that ignited a faint ember of hope deep in her chest, a dangerous but irresistible promise that maybe, just maybe, her suffering might not be the end of her story. Silas turned sharply, sensing the intrusion, and his voice, sharp as the crack of a whip, cut through the street. "Who dares interfere?" he barked, rage coiling around every syllable. Jackson stepped fully into the light, hat tipped back slightly, posture unyielding. "No one has the right to claim her like property," he said, voice calm but edged with steel. The wind picked up, sending loose dust spiraling around them like the prelude to a storm. For a moment time seemed to pause, the creaking wheels, the hushed whispers, the distant caw of a crow overhead, all frozen. The townsfolk collectively held their breath, caught between the terror of Silas's wrath and the magnetism of Jackson's resolve. And then, without another word, Jackson advanced, each step deliberate, purposeful. The challenge was clear. Either Silas would face the consequences of cruelty, or the town would witness a tragedy that could not be undone. Eliza's heart pounded against her ribs, hope and fear warring within her. The streets of Dry Creek, once a place of silent complicity, were about to be shaken to their foundations. But what came next would shock the whole town, and no one, not even Jackson, could yet predict the price of courage. The midday sun beat down mercilessly over Dry Creek, turning the wooden facades of the saloons, general stores, and sheriff's office into glowing embers. Dust swirled in spirals across the empty streets, catching in the ruts of wagon wheels and clinging to the hems of dresses. Inside the sheriff's office, the air was thick with unease, a tension that pressed against the walls like smoke from a distant fire. Silas Crow's voice cut through it all, sharp as a whip crack, as he proclaimed his intentions to claim Eliza as his bride. "She'll marry me, whether she likes it or not," he said, his tone cold, final. Some townsfolk shifted uneasily, heads bowed, nodding out of fear. Others murmured behind shutters and shuttered windows, defiance hidden in whispers. The tension rippled through the room, a river barely contained by civility. Eliza's eyes wide and glistening scanned the crowd, finding only a handful of sympathetic faces. Mrs. Harper, a widow whose own children had been claimed by sickness and time, stared at her with silent understanding, the corners of her mouth trembling with sorrow and anger. The injustice of it all pressed heavily on the young girl's chest. From the back of the room, Jackson moved quietly, boots scraping against the wooden floorboards, a shadow among shadows. He observed the murmurs, the quick glances, the silent fear etched into every furrowed brow. Each detail told him more about the town, about the people who had long since surrendered to Silas's reign of terror. And yet, beneath the surface, he could see sparks of courage, the flickers of quiet defiance that might ignite if given reason to believe in hope. Jackson approached Eliza carefully, kneeling slightly so that their eyes met. Her gaze was red-rimmed, her lips quivering with unshed tears. "Hold on. I promise. This isn't the end," he murmured, voice low but unwavering. His words were a tether to a world beyond her despair, a lifeline she had not dared to imagine existed. She swallowed hard, a fragile nod betraying the tiniest ember of hope. The moment was fleeting. Silas's sharp eyes caught sight of Jackson stepping forward, his face twisted in anger, muscles taut with sudden fury. "Who's this? Another meddler?" he roared, the sunlight glinting off the steel of the whip at his side. The crowd recoiled, breaths caught in their throats. The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in as tension coiled like a rattlesnake ready to strike. Jackson squared his shoulders, chin lifted, refusing to show the flicker of fear that threatened to rise within him. A cruel laugh tore through the dusty air, sharp and cutting. "You'll regret stepping into this, stranger," Silas spat, his words dripping with menace. The townsfolk exchanged anxious glances, whispers fluttering like frightened birds. Some dared to question him quietly, hidden behind the safety of doors and shutters, but no one stepped forward, not yet. The air vibrated with suspense, the unspoken understanding that something monumental was about to unfold. Outside, the wind picked up, scattering stray dust and paper scraps across the street. The horses in nearby stables stamped nervously, sensing the invisible tension that gripped the town. Jackson's eyes never left Silas, calculating, anticipating, waiting for the precise moment when courage might overcome fear. Eliza clutched at the thin fabric of her dress, trembling, yet watching him with a glimmer of trust that she dared not fully voice. Every heartbeat seemed amplified. The room held its breath, and in that suspended moment, the entire town felt the edge of what was coming. One wrong move, one spark, and the fragile balance of fear and defiance would ignite. The whispers, the stares, the silent prayers, they all hinted at the inevitable clash between cruelty and courage. And as Silas's cruel grin widened, the unspoken question hung over everyone like a storm cloud. Who would stand when the first blow fell? But what came next would shock the entire town, forever changing the lives of a lonely girl, a silent cowboy, and a community too long shackled by fear. Eliza sat alone in the cramped, dimly lit room above the saloon, the creaking floorboards beneath her weight echoing in the silence. The walls were cracked and faded, plaster flaking in uneven patterns, a mirror of the life she had endured, fragile, harsh, and unforgiving. For a long moment she let her tears fall, the salt stinging her cheeks as she pressed her fingers to her lips, muffling a sob. But then something inside her shifted. The trembling that had once consumed her was replaced with a quiet determination, a strength forged in years of survival. She pressed her palms to the rough wood of the windowsill, feeling its cold soul, itty beneath her fingers, grounding her. Her mind drifted back to the orphanage where she had grown up, a place filled with hunger, neglect, and the biting cold of winter nights. She remembered the nights when blankets were thin or non-existent, the days when food was scarce and harsh words were abundant. She had learned then to endure, to hide her fear behind a careful calm, to survive by keeping her heart close and her spirit closer. Those years had made her resilient in ways no one in Dry Creek could imagine. "I've survived worse. I can survive this," she whispered, voice barely audible but fierce, like a tiny spark refusing to die in the darkness. A sudden memory of Jackson's words flickered through her mind, his promise, quiet but unwavering, that this nightmare might not be the end. That single sentence, spoken with the authority of a man who had seen injustice too many times to ignore it, was enough to ignite hope where despair had reigned. Hope, fragile and delicate, began to take root in her chest, mingling with the anger that had been smoldering under the weight of Silas Crow's tyranny. Below her, the town was stirring with anticipation she could only sense through muffled sounds of boots on wooden sidewalks, the creak of wagon wheels, and the distant neigh of restless horses. Silas, ever cruel, was busy preparing a grand ceremony to parade her misery through the town square, mocking her with every detail of the event. His laughter drifted faintly upward, a jagged reminder of the humiliation she was expected to endure. But she refused to shrink any longer. Her fists clenched, nails biting into palms, as she made a silent promise. She would endure, she would resist, and she would not let fear claim her. Meanwhile, Jackson rode hard along the outskirts of town, the dust of the prairie kicking up behind his horse, clinging to his boots and jacket. He moved with purpose, eyes scanning the horizon, noting every figure that crossed his path. A few honest townsfolk, quietly emboldened by his courage, joined him, nodding in silent agreement to stand against Silas's cruelty. Ranch hands, long oppressed by the tyrant's authority, fell in beside him, their faces set with determination. Each rider, each hidden ally, became part of a slow, deliberate storm gathering strength at the edge of Dry Creek. Jackson halted on a small rise overlooking the town, the wind tugging at his coat and hat, carrying with it the faint sense of smoke, dust, and distant pine. He turned to his small group, voice steady and low but filled with resolve. "He's cruel, yes, but no one, no matter how powerful, can break the will of those who refuse to be broken. Today we fight for her. And for all of us." Murmurs of agreement passed through the riders, and a quiet energy began to crackle, a current of courage ready to surge. As Eliza pressed her forehead against the cold glass of the window, she could feel it, a shift in the air, subtle but undeniable. Somewhere beyond the rooftops, Jackson and his allies were preparing, ready to face a man who had ruled through fear for far too long. Her pulse quickened, fear still lingering, but now accompanied by the bright ember of hope. Somewhere below, the town would soon witness the stirrings of rebellion, and in that knowledge, Eliza found the first true sense of power she had ever known. And in that suspended moment, as the sun dipped low and cast long shadows across Dry Creek, the quiet strength of an orphan girl and the determined courage of a wandering cowboy aligned, foreshadowing a confrontation that would shake the town to its very core. The town square of Dry Creek was a furnace of late afternoon heat, the sun sinking low, casting long, jagged shadows across the dusty streets. Wooden storefronts glowed in amber light, their windows reflecting the tension that thickened the air. A brittle wind swept through the square, rattling shutters and stirring loose papers like restless spirits. On one side, Silas Crow and his posse waited, boots planted firmly in the dirt, hands resting lightly on the leather grips of their revolvers, smug confidence etched in every line of their faces. Silas's eyes gleamed with entitlement, the cruel smirk never leaving his face. He believed victory was certain, that the law and fear of the townsfolk were firmly on his side. Across the square, the thud of horse hooves echoed as Jackson and his small band emerged from the opposite edge, dust trailing behind them like a smoky banner of defiance. The few men who had agreed to stand with him tightened their grips on worn rifles, eyes scanning the crowd for threats. Jackson's boots hit the ground with deliberate force as he dismounted, his wide-brimmed hat shadowing a face set in grim determination. Every muscle in his body was taut, ready, and unyielding. The wind tugged at his coat, tugged at the edges of courage that clung to the hearts of those who dared to hope. Above the square, in a shuttered window, Eliza pressed her hands to the frame, knuckles white. Her pulse raced as she watched the approaching figures. Fear churned in her stomach, but beneath it, a spark of hope flared, ignited by Jackson's unwavering gaze and the knowledge that someone had chosen to defy Silas for her sake. The shadows of the town seemed to stretch and twist around her, every movement magnified by the weight of anticipation. Jackson stopped at the center of the square, slowly removing his hat, letting the sun illuminate his face and steel in his eyes. Silas stepped forward, spurred by arrogance and the need to assert dominance, and the distance between the two men shrank, yet the tension swelled to fill every inch of the square. Dust clung to their boots, circling in the wind like ghosts of past injustices waiting to witness the reckoning. "You'll regret this, cowboy," Silas barked, voice sharp and dripping with menace. "She's mine by law." His posse shifted behind him, a wall of intimidation. The townsfolk pressed back against walls and door frames, whispering and exchanging anxious glances, unsure whether to flee or support the unfolding drama. Jackson's gaze never wavered. "Some laws aren't worth following," he said evenly, voice carrying across the sun-baked square. "Step aside, or I'll do what's right." His hand hovered near the grip of his revolver, a silent promise that justice, not fear, would prevail. The words hung in the air, a spark in a powder keg. Silas's laugh cut the tension like a knife, cruel and sharp. "You think you can defy me in my own town?" he sneered, flexing his fingers over the grip of his revolver. "You'll learn why no one stands against me." The townsfolk shrank back, uncertainty etched on every face. Some whispered to neighbors, casting fearful glances at Jackson's small group, unsure whether courage could truly overcome the shadow of tyranny. Others clutched the edges of doors and railings, hearts hammering, waiting for the inevitable clash. The wind seemed to carry the collective heartbeat of the town, thrumming in rhythm with the rising tension. Jackson and Silas began to circle each other, movements deliberate and slow, revolvers at the ready. Each step echoed like a drumbeat of destiny. Their eyes locked, measuring, calculating, waiting for the first mistake, the first tremor that would decide the day. Dust swirled around them, golden in the sinking sunlight, while the townsfolk held their breath, caught between fear and anticipation. Above, Eliza pressed her face to the window, tears threatening again, but her hands remained firm on the frame. Somewhere in the square, courage and cruelty faced off in the sun, and the entire town seemed suspended in a heartbeat. Every nerve and muscle in Jackson's body tensed. Every twitch in Silas's smirk radiated threat. The first shot, the first move, the first act of defiance or submission would set the story of Dry Creek forever. And as the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the dusty square in flames of gold and crimson, one truth became undeniable. The quiet orphan girl, the silent cowboy, and the tyrant's arrogance were on a collision course, and the town would never be the same again. Whispers spread like wildfire through Dry Creek, carried on the wind and through narrow alleyways. Jackson's defiance of Silas Crow had become the talk of the town, murmured behind doors, whispered across dusty porches, and carried along the wooden planks of the boardwalks. Fear and admiration tangled in equal measure among the townsfolk, many unsure which side to take. Some, cowering behind shutters, silently prayed for the storm to pass. Others, emboldened by Jackson's courage, began quietly plotting to resist the tyrant who had long ruled their lives with fear. Among them, Mrs. Harper moved with purpose, her eyes sharp and determined. She rallied a few trusted neighbors, sabotaging Silas's efforts where they could, loosened wagon wheels, misdirected horses, whispered warnings, all tiny acts of rebellion, yet potent in the moment. Above it all, in her cramped room over the saloon, Eliza felt a stirring inside her chest. The ember of courage Jackson had lit days before now glowed bright, mingling with the anger that had been quietly simmering in her soul. She pressed her palms to the cool wood of the window frame, staring down at the square where the confrontation would soon unfold. Every step toward freedom would be dangerous. Every shadow could conceal an enemy, yet the thought of sitting idle, of letting fear dictate her life, was intolerable. With a steadying breath, she slipped open the window, letting the stale air brush against her face. The streets were mostly empty, the townsfolk hiding behind their facades of obedience, but she moved with careful determination, stepping lightly across the narrow beams above the alleyways, past shuttered windows that hid both complicity and fear. Each creak of the floorboards beneath her echoed like a drumbeat, each distant cough or muttered word of a neighbor amplifying the stakes of her silent rebellion. Through the dim corridors of the town, past the flickering shadows of lamplight and sun-streaked dust, she made her way toward the square, heart hammering in her chest, every nerve alive with tension. Jackson, standing near the center of the approaching standoff, spotted movement near the saloon. His sharp eyes followed the delicate figure slipping through the shadows, recognizing the unmistakable silhouette of Eliza. "Don't come out," he called, voice carrying across the empty street, edged with desperation and command. But she pressed on, a silent defiance driving her forward, refusing to be invisible any longer. Fear gripped him momentarily, knowing the risks she faced, yet he could not stop her resolve from rising above the peril. Below, Silas's attention snapped to the movement as he noticed Eliza's absence. His smirk twisted into a snarl, rage flaring in his eyes. "Where's that girl?" he barked, fists clenching around the handle of his whip. "Do you think you can sneak past me in my town?" His posse shifted uneasily, uncertainty creeping into their bravado as the first threads of doubt began to fray their confidence. Silas's cruelty was unmatched, yet the sight of Jackson standing defiantly had begun to stir the silent courage in the shadows of the town. Eliza's journey through the narrow streets felt like a lifetime compressed into a heartbeat. Every corner could conceal danger, every shadow a potential trap, yet she moved with the quiet strength that had been honed by years of hardship and survival. Her breath caught as she slipped between crates and barrels, past the familiar faces of neighbors who had long tolerated Silas's tyranny. The contrast of complicity and subtle support weighed on her, deepening her empathy for the town, for the ones too afraid to speak, and for the ones daring to act. Finally, she emerged from the shadows into the open square. The wind carried the faint scent of dust and leather, mingled with the tension of imminent confrontation. Jackson's gaze locked onto hers, relief and worry mixing in his eyes, yet he held his stance, ready for the inevitable. Silas, noticing her presence, froze for a fraction of a second, the smug certainty that had dominated the town wavering as the orphan girl stood, small but unyielding, in the center of the square. The town held its breath. Silence, thick and expectant, descended like a heavy curtain. Eliza's face, pale yet resolute, met the gaze of the menacing figure who had claimed to control her destiny. For the first time, she was no longer a victim. For the first time, she stepped into her own story, daring to confront her fear, leaving the audience suspended on the knife edge of anticipation, waiting for what would come next. Eliza's feet pounded against the dusty boards of the square, her heart hammering louder than the distant church bell. Each step carried a lifetime of fear, anger, and determination. She reached Jackson just as Silas Crow raised his hand, whip coiled like a viper ready to strike. Time seemed to stretch and twist in that instant, the sun sinking low, gilding the scene in gold and crimson, the dust swirling lazily in the still air. Every eye in the town square followed the unfolding tableau. Breaths held, hearts racing. Jackson's boots scuffed the dirt as he stepped in front of Eliza, his broad shoulders a shield against the storm of Silas's cruelty. His voice boomed across the square, unwavering and sharp, cutting through the tension like a whip crack. "I promised her safety, and I intend to keep it, no matter the cost." Every syllable carried the weight of unflinching determination, echoing in the silent streets, bouncing off wooden storefronts, and imprinting itself on every heart present. A gasp rippled through the crowd, a mixture of awe, fear, and disbelief. For years, Silas Crow had ruled through terror, and now one man dared to challenge him openly. The audacity of Jackson's stand made the townsfolk pause in their murmurs, their whispered loyalty shaken by the courage that radiated from the cowboy and the girl behind him. Silas smirked, a cruel, confident curl of the lip. He flexed the fingers that gripped his whip, the leather glinting in the dying sun. "You think words can change anything, cowboy?" he sneered. "She belongs to me." Eliza, her trembling hands rising slightly, spoke for the first time since leaving her room, voice quivering but growing steadier with each word. I don't have to marry him." The simple declaration hung in the square like a fragile, defiant flame, challenging the heavy shadow of oppression that Silas had cast for so long. Jackson's eyes met hers, pride and relief flickering briefly before returning to steel. "Not anymore," he said firmly, voice resonant and unwavering. "She belongs to no one but herself." His words struck like a bell in the still air, resonating with justice, courage, and truth. The townsfolk froze, their breaths caught mid-chest, shadows elongating across the square as if the sun itself hesitated to fall. For a fleeting moment, the world seemed to pause. The wind stilled, dust hung suspended, and even Silas seemed caught in a moment of disbelief. The power of the vow, combined with the courage emanating from Eliza, created a tension that was almost tangible, like the taut string of a drawn bow. The silent support of the townsfolk, their fear mingling with the faint stirrings of courage, pressed against Silas like an invisible wall, making him hesitate for the first time in years. His eyes flicked across the crowd, sensing the shifting loyalties, the trembling resolve, the quiet rebellion. For all his bluster, the weight of Jackson's vow and Eliza's defiance was a force he had never reckoned with. The whip in Silas's hand quivered slightly, not from weakness, but from the uncertain currents in the square. He realized that cruelty alone might not carry the day, that audacity and conviction could break even the strongest chains of fear. The sun cast long, dramatic shadows, stretching across the wooden facades and the dirt beneath their boots, turning the square into a cinematic canvas of suspense and impending reckoning. In that frozen moment, the town seemed to collectively hold its breath. Would Silas strike and enforce his tyranny? Or would the courage of a cowboy, an orphan girl, and the silent acknowledgement of the oppressed finally shatter the chains of fear? Every eye was fixed, every heartbeat synchronized, every shadow whispering that the course of Dry Creek and the fate of a young girl was about to be irrevocably changed. The square erupted into motion as Silas Crow lunged forward, whip slicing through the heavy afternoon air, his face twisted with rage. The townsfolk gasped and scrambled, some ducking for cover, others moving instinctively to aid Jackson without attracting Silas's immediate notice. Dust rose in clouds beneath pounding boots, clattering hooves, and the tumult of adrenaline-charged hearts. Every shadow seemed alive with tension, every creaking board echoing the peril of the moment. Jackson met Silas's fury head-on, his revolver holstered but fists and instincts ready. He moved with precise agility, sidestepping the vicious lash while keeping a protective stance in front of Eliza. Each strike Silas attempted was met with deft blocks and sharp counters. Every snap of leather across the air was a warning and a promise. "Enough! This ends today!" Jackson shouted, his voice carrying through the square, commanding attention, rallying courage. Eliza's breath came in sharp bursts as she watched, but fear was tempered with rising strength. In the chaos, she saw her moment. The whip lashed near her, and without hesitation she lunged, grabbing Silas's arm, yanking the weapon free. The crack of the leather hitting the dirt was a punctuation mark to the sudden shift. "I am not yours," she screamed, her voice trembling yet firm, slicing through the tension like a blade. Her courage was a spark, igniting the courage of the hidden townsfolk. From the alleys and behind barrels, townspeople began to act. A crate toppled into Silas's path, a horse startled him with a sudden neigh, and subtle, well-timed interference slowed his attacks. The once powerful tyrant was now cornered, frustration painting his features red as Jackson pressed forward, fists and feet moving in a disciplined rhythm of defiance and protection. "You can't take what's mine!" Silas roared, whipping at air and shadows, desperate to assert control. But the odds had shifted. The sun dipped lower, casting long, dramatic shadows that stretched like accusatory fingers across the square. Every movement was amplified, the slap of a boot against dirt, the sway of the townsfolk, the gleam of a revolver catching sunlight, the defiance in Eliza's wide, tear-brimmed eyes. Jackson and Silas circled each other, the violence of desperation against skill and determination. The whip, now in Eliza's hands, symbolized the turning tide, her bravery a visual and emotional anchor for the audience. A sudden lunge from Silas aimed to regain dominance, but Jackson was ready. He blocked, grabbed Silas's wrist, and, with a swift maneuver, disarmed him entirely. The whip clattered to the ground, the metallic echo of defeat reverberating through the square. Silas stumbled backward, humiliated and powerless. The fear that had long kept the town in chains now reflected in his wide, unguarded eyes. Jackson's chest heaved as he held his ground, not just against Silas, but against the legacy of fear he embodied. For a moment, silence fell, a suspended heartbeat over the square. The townsfolk emerged from their hiding, faces bright with disbelief and hope. Mrs. Harper and others quietly stepped forward, their small acts of support now visible and undeniable. The oppressive weight that had blanketed Dry Creek for years began to lift, replaced by the undeniable truth that courage and justice could overcome tyranny. Eliza stepped forward, shoulders squared, the sunset painting her face in fiery gold. The square was alive with newfound energy, a town witnessing the birth of a new order where fear no longer ruled and the bravery of one cowboy, one orphan girl, and a few courageous townsfolk had altered their fate. In that chaotic, heart-pounding moment, Jackson's vow and Eliza's defiance fused into a palpable force that would define Dry Creek for years to come. The standoff had ended, the tyrant defeated, but the emotional resonance lingered. Proof that even the smallest, most vulnerable among us could rise to challenge injustice and change the course of a town forever. The sun dipped low over Dry Creek, painting the town in shades of gold and crimson, as if the very sky itself celebrated the end of tyranny. Silas Crow, humiliated and defeated, slunk out of the square, shoulders slumped, eyes downcast. The once feared rancher who had ruled through cruelty and intimidation now became a shadow of his former self, a cautionary tale for anyone who might consider spreading fear. The dusty street, once filled with hushed whispers and fearful glances, now held a tentative, hopeful energy. Eliza stood beside Jackson, her skirts brushing the warm dirt beneath her boots, cheeks wet with tears of relief rather than sorrow. Her shoulders were steady, chin lifted, eyes shining with a newfound strength. The townsfolk, many of whom had hidden behind shutters or scurried away in fear only hours before, now emerged slowly, their steps cautious but confident, their faces reflecting awe and gratitude. She took a deep breath, her voice carrying across the square with clarity and resolve. "I may have been alone, but no longer. Courage and kindness can win over cruelty," she declared, her words imbued with the weight of her journey, from a frightened orphan, forced into submission, to a young woman who had reclaimed her agency. The crowd absorbed her words in silence, some nodding, some wiping tears, others murmuring in quiet admiration. Jackson's hand brushed hers ever so slightly, a gesture both protective and tender, yet entirely unspoken. In that quiet contact lay the bond forged through shared struggle, danger, and unwavering resolve. He smiled softly, eyes warm, and in that moment, no words were necessary. Their partnership and mutual respect spoke louder than any declaration. Mrs. Harper stepped forward, her face streaked with tears that glinted like tiny jewels in the dying sunlight. She embraced Eliza tightly, whispering, "You've given us all hope again, child. You've reminded us that fear is never stronger than courage." Eliza's heart swelled as she returned the embrace, feeling the deep connection of a chosen family, a bond forged not by blood, but by shared bravery and empathy. Around them, the town of Dry Creek seemed to breathe for the first time in years. Windows opened, doors creaked, and muted conversations blossomed into cautious laughter. Neighbors helped one another sweep dust from the boardwalks, mend broken signs, and share water and bread, where silence and fear had reigned. Murmurs of hope and admiration now resonated, carrying the promise of a future no longer dictated by the cruel whims of a tyrant. Eliza glanced at Jackson, the orange and purple sky behind him framing his silhouette like a hero from a legend. Without a word, they turned together, walking down the main street toward the horizon. Dust rose gently with their steps, illuminated by the golden glow of sunset. Each stride was a statement of resilience, a symbol that courage and justice could prevail even in the harshest of landscapes. As they reached the edge of town, the camera, or the audience's gaze, followed them into the vast expanse of open plains, the wind carrying whispers of freedom and renewal. The square remained behind them, quiet but alive with the promise of tomorrow. Children peeked from behind doorways, townsfolk exchanged hopeful glances, and the lingering fear that had gripped the town for so long began to dissolve. In that final cinematic frame, Jackson and Eliza walked side by side, the sky stretching endlessly before them, a visual testament to new beginnings. The narrative of Dry Creek had shifted forever, from oppression and fear to hope, courage, and the unshakable truth that even the smallest acts of bravery could change the fate of an entire town. Their story lingered in the hearts of all who watched, a timeless reminder that justice, love, and courage would always find a way to shine through the darkest of shadows.